Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. If you enjoy this video, please do your part and become a member of the channel, or drop me a super thanks. If you can't do either of those, well, please just like and subscribe. It's really appreciated. On this channel, we've talked about naval aircraft before, but I think this is the very first time where we're going to talk about an aircraft and the ship to carry it being designed at the same time. So I will be looking at the ship too during this episode. Should we spin off a new show called World of Warships? Maybe, but not right at this moment. And I've been saying ship, but the vessel built to carry this aircraft was actually a boat, because that is what we traditionally call a submarine. Even a monster sub like the I-400. So, for the Seiran and her submarine mothership, let's dive in. The idea for an attack aircraft carrying submarine came from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Although it needs to be understood that Yamamoto did not come up with the idea of a submarine aircraft carrier. As far back as 1932, Japan had been experimenting with and using aircraft carrying submarines, mainly in the scouting and reconnaissance role. This is actually a pretty good pairing of technologies for this job. The submarine gets you in close and unseen, but being very low in the water, you can't see much. But if you're able to pull an aircraft out of a hangar and launch that, then you can get a pretty good look at what you want to see and hopefully get out of dodge before anyone notices you. The first was the Type J1M scouting submarine, which was completed on the 1st of July 1932. It carried a disassembled Yokosuka E6Y reconnaissance biplane in a watertight deck compartment. Between then and 1942, Japan built and launched almost 40 aircraft-carrying submarines. It was almost immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor that Admiral Yamamoto commissioned a feasibility study to explore the idea of attacking the mainland United States using submarine-launched naval aircraft. Now, it seems like maybe some preliminary work had already been done on this because the study was done in less than a month. On the other hand, it was wartime, but I'm just used to the idea of modern weapons taking decades to get off the drawing board. But Yamamoto was able to submit his proposal to the fleet headquarters on 13th of January 1942. He asked for 18 large submarines with an unprecedented range able to accomplish a round-trip voyage to any point on the globe. In effect, this would allow a theoretical 3 round trips to the west coast of the United States without refueling. Add to that the requirement that these submarines had to be able to store and launch at least 2 bombing aircraft, so a watertight 11-foot diameter cylindrical hangar was to be built on deck. The aircraft were to be armed with 1 torpedo or 800 kilograms, that's 1,800 pounds, of bombs. Again, with incredible speed, the general design plans for the submarines were finalized by the 17th of March, and within a year of Admiral Yamamoto's idea, construction of the I-400 submarine began at Kure Dock Yards on the 18th of January 1943. A total of 18 boats were ordered. However, let's pause looking at the sub for a bit and shift over to the aircraft that the sub was meant to carry. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service tapped the Aichi Kokuki Kabushiki Keisha, or Aichi Aircraft Company Limited, to look into designing the attack aircraft. It needed to have a range of 1,500 kilometers, that's 810 nautical miles, and a speed of 300 knots, that's 555 kilometers per hour. Of course, it needed to be folded into the confined space of the watertight hangar of the I-400. Aichi started by trying a shortcut. They took the D4Y1 Suisi, which was known as Judy to the Allies, which was a small single-engine carrier dive bomber, and began to work to try to modify it for use aboard the submarine. This would have saved plenty of design work, and the Judy was already an aircraft with good performance. But in the end, it was decided that modifying the Judy was going to be more difficult than just starting from scratch. So to the drawing board they went to come up with a whole new design. And what they came up with was an even more sleek and, yes, attractive-looking plane than the Judy. Sorry, Judy. That had many features that were very unique for its very unique role. For power, it was installed with a 1,410 horsepower Aichi AE1P Atsuta 30 engine, which was a license-built copy of the veritable German Daimler-Benz DB601 liquid-cooled V12 engine, which provided power to the ME109, 110, 210, and others back in Europe. To allow for storage within the submarine's 11-foot, that's 3.5-meter diameter cylindrical hangar, the aircraft's wings rotated 90 degrees and folded with hydraulic power against the aircraft's fuselage. The tail would also fold down to fit. As stated earlier, the armament was to be a single 1,870-pound torpedo, or the equal weight in bombs. There was to be a crew of 2, the pilot and observer in the back, who would also double as a gunner, operating a 13mm machine gun on a flexible mount. The aircraft was given the identifier Aichi M6A and the name Seiran, which means clear sky storm, which I guess is pretty fitting, as the point of this aircraft was to strike, without warning, like a storm out of a cloudless sky. Perhaps the most interesting feature of the Seiran was the undercarriage options. In the most conventional type mission, the Seiran would be mounted on floats and launched on its mission to later return and then land on these floats beside the sub for retrieval. But there were other options. Let's say the Seiran was being chased on its way back to the sub and wanted a boost in performance. The pilot could jettison the floats in flight in order to get rid of that drag and then ditch into the water for retrieval. If the mission was considered more, let's just say, one way, the floats could be left off altogether and the Seiran launched without any undercarriage at all. The first prototype Seirans were completed in October 1943, and flight testing started the month later in November. There seems to have been few issues with the new aircraft, and the only tinkering that I found was that the foldable tail fin needed to be enlarged a bit. Otherwise, it was a good airplane. And full-scale production was okayed for the beginning of 1944. In order to help train pilots more easily, a wheeled version with retractable landing gear was also introduced. And this was known as the M6A1K Nanzan, which means Southern Mountain. So now we have a submarine launchable aircraft. Do we have a submarine capable of launching aircraft? How goes the progress on the I-400? And it was actually coming along nicely. The hull for the sub had been laid down in Curie dockyards on the 18th of January 1943 and was ready for launch on that same day in 1944. Just as the Seiran was completing flight testing and was beginning production. This is pretty impressive, considering the scale of the boats and the features that needed to be built in order for it to do its job. Firstly, let's talk about size. The I-400 was the biggest submarine ever to be built, and would keep that title for another 21 years. Until the launching of the USS Benjamin Franklin, SSBN 640, in 1965. Which was a U.S. Navy nuclear-powered ballistic missile sub. The I-400 was 120 meters long. That's almost 400 feet long overall and displaced almost 6,000 tons. They were more than double the size of the U.S. fleet boats that were preying on Japanese shipping at the time. It was powered by 4 diesel engines, producing 2,250 horsepower each, and driving two 2,100 horsepower electric motors. She could make almost 19 knots on the surface and about 7 knots while submerged. To feed those diesel engines, the sub could carry enough fuel to reach either coast of the USA and return to Japan. The point of this boat was to carry aircraft. So, to accomplish that, on the top deck was installed the cylindrical, watertight aircraft hangar. It was 31 meters, that's 102 feet long, and 3.5 meters, that's 11 feet in diameter. The giant door, which was made waterproof with a 2-inch wide rubber gasket, could either be opened manually from the outside by turning a large hand wheel, or could be opened hydraulically from within the submarine. In order to allow the hangar to be on the center line of the sub, the I-400's conning tower was obliged to be offset to port, which would have consequences as we shall see later. The sub was not to be just a toothless transport. For defense against enemy aircraft, the sub sported 4 waterproofed Type 96 triple-mount 25mm autocannon. To spot enemy aircraft earlier, the I-400 was fitted with radars that could see out to a range of 80 kilometers, that's 43 nautical miles. For fighting other ships, the I-400 had a single Type 11 140mm, that's a 5.5-inch deck gun, which was located after the hangar and could hit targets 15 kilometers, 10 miles away. The I-400 also had 8 forward torpedo tubes, but none in the rear. To protect against magnetic mines, the sub was installed with 2 parallel sets of demagnetization cables, which were supposed to eliminate the magnetic field, which would trigger magnetic mines. To protect against sonar, a special coating made from gum, asbestos, and adhesives was applied to the hulls. The idea was that the coating would absorb the sonar waves and not allow them to bounce back to the enemy receiver. It also prevented machine and other noises from getting out of the hull. Some features of the sub were strictly due to its role as an aircraft carrier. A collapsible crane for retrieving the Seirans when they landed on the water was stowed in a recessed compartment on the forward port side. It was raised mechanically by use of a motor located inside the boat and was electrically powered and could lift about 5 tons. As the plan was for the sub to launch its aircraft and then submerge and stay in a previously decided spot for the Seirans to return to later for retrieval, a special trim system was included on the boat, allowing for it to loiter underwater and remain stationary. Speed of launch of the aircraft would be a very important factor. For every moment on the surface, the I-400s would be very vulnerable. One time-consuming procedure for piston engine aircraft is the run-up, when the engine is run at high RPM to warm itself up and to get its precious lubricating fluids up to a proper operating temperature. Doing a run-up while still submerged wasn't practical, so a system was devised where very hot water would be run through the engine's cooling system to warm the engine block up, and preheated engine oil would be pumped in just prior to engine start. The crews were drilled incessantly in order to train for quick launches, and the goal was to surface, open the door, push a Seiran out of the hangar on a special catapult carriage, attach the pontoons, and be ready for flight in 7 minutes. At that point, a 26-meter or 85-foot long compressed air catapult mounted on the forward deck would fling the plane into the air. As both the air and water technologies were being readied, the next step was to decide on a mission for the I-400s and their birds. In August of 1944, it was decided that hitting and disabling the Panama Canal would be a worthy target. Damaging the canal would majorly disrupt the American supply lines to the Pacific Ocean, and add an enormous distance in transferring warships from one ocean to the other. plans were drawn up to attack the Gatun locks, which are the ones on the Atlantic side, as the loss of these were seen to be the most damaging to the system. To increase the power of the attack, the already completed I-400 and her sister, the I-401, would be used to carry 3 Seirans each, as well as the I-13 and I-14, which would be modified to carry 2 each. Originally, the plan was for the Seirans to carry a combination of torpedoes and bombs to use against the lock doors, but as there was insufficient time to complete torpedo training with the pilots, it was decided to just go with bombs. The plan was for the fleet of 4 subs to make their way east across the Pacific, which was expected to take perhaps 2 months, to a point about 185 kilometers, that's 100 nautical miles, off the coast of Ecuador. Here, the Seirans would be launched at night and without floats. They would fly east across Colombia to the Caribbean side and then turn west and hit the canal docks at dawn, continuing west to return to the rendezvous point. They would then ditch beside the waiting submarines and the air crews would be picked up. The Seirans would be lost. But it was a pretty ingenious plan. And just think of it. This target, which was facing the Atlantic Ocean, would be hit from a fleet sitting in the Pacific Ocean. But the fortunes of this audacious weapon system and its plans were already on the wane. This combined sub and attack plane idea was Yamamoto's baby, and when he was killed in April 1943, his baby took a hit too, and the number of I-400s on the order sheet was chopped from 18 to 9. Who knows what may have happened if Yamamoto had lived, but the 9 was then reduced to 5 and finally to 3. Of those 3, only I-400 and I-401 actually entered service with their original role. I-402 was completed as a tanker instead, just 5 weeks before the end of the war, and she never even made it to sea. Perhaps it was just as well. The I-400s were not the best submarines. While on the surface, the large aircraft hangar and conning tower had huge visual and radar signatures. They also had difficulty running to escape because their great size and small rudders made them difficult to maneuver, and they had the tendency to veer off course during a strong wind. Diving was also a problem, as they couldn't even dive deeper than they were long, and they took almost a minute to dive, which was double that of normal subs. While running underwater, the offset conning tower made them pull to port, requiring steering 7 degrees to starboard to correct the track. And the captain had to take into account that the boat had a larger turning circle to starboard than to port. But the Panama Canal mission was still moving forward. A full-scale wooden model of the Gatun Locks Gate had been built at Nano Wan, and by June 1945, all 4 of the aircraft-carrying submarines had arrived and began training to assemble, catapult, launch, and recover the aircraft. Although, by this time, the recovery part wasn't necessary anymore. It had been decided by leadership that this would be a one-way kamikaze-type flight. So, attaching the pontoons would no longer be needed, nor would any pilots be recovered. Now, no one had told the pilots this, and so it must have been a super awkward moment when one pilot realized that the bomb release mechanisms were being removed from the aircraft, and he went on to ask his commander about it. Remember, they hadn't actually signed up for suicide missions. By the 20th of June, they were ready to go, but the fall of Okinawa changed the situation dramatically, and instead, the task force was designated to hit a cluster of 15 U.S. aircraft carriers at Ulithi Atoll. The plan now was for the subs to make their way to a point within range of Ulithi, and on the early morning of the 17th of August, they would launch their Seirans. Again, it would be a kamikaze mission against the American carriers. The Seirans would fly below radar at altitudes less than 50 meters, that's 160 feet, and again carrying the 1,800-pound bomb, each to fly into a carrier. To add insult to injury, death I guess, to the Seiran pilots, their planes were painted silver, and even their red rondelles being painted over with the American stars and bars. This was meant to confuse the American gunners, and I suppose the Seirans would look quite a bit like US AAF Mustangs at that point, but it was a violation of the rules of war, and the pilots thought it terribly dishonorable to the Imperial Navy. But nobody seemed to be listening much to their opinions anyway. On the way to the rendezvous point, I-13 was spotted on the surface by radar-equipped TBM Avengers on the 16th of July. They attacked and damaged her, and an American destroyer arrived later and finished her off with depth charges. The other three subs never got their chance, as Japan surrendered several days before the planned attack. The Seirans were catapulted off their motherships for the last time, engines off, pilotless, and with their wings and tails still folded. It was an inauspicious end to a very auspicious plan. Again, it is perhaps just as well. Another plan that had been considered for the I-400 and Seiran combo was to send 5 subs and their aircraft to hit San Diego, California. This attack, called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, was intended to drop biological weapons filled with diseased fleas on the population, causing an epidemic that would hopefully spread to the entire West Coast and kill tens of thousands of Americans. But, in the end, the I-400s were inspected by the US Navy and then scuttled. Luckily enough, a single M6A Seiran was picked up at the Aichi factory at the end of the war and is now preserved at the Udvar-Hazy Center, which is part of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum located in Chantilly, Virginia, and is yet another reason for me to go and visit there. As we get to the end of the story, there may be a feeling that the whole thing was just a dumb idea that never would have panned out. Well, I will leave you with the fact that the only time the continental USA was bombed by an enemy aircraft was by a Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn floatplane, which, yes, was launched and recovered by an aircraft-carrying submarine, the I-25. But that is a plane, and a boat, and a story for another day. If you enjoyed this video, please consider dropping me a super thanks, or join my crew and become a member of the channel. There are advantages to being a member, with exclusive content, badges, and Warbird emojis. If you can't do any of those, then please just like and subscribe. It's really appreciated. Until next time.